She lay on a bedding of insulated material in the medical bay of Deep Refuge, with her eyes closed and her breathing shallow, and her body finally surrendering to everything it had endured since the moment the Aurelio fell from the sky. Orveth the Dulani examined her with the few medical instruments they had left, and what he found made him go very quiet. Severe frostbite on both hands, with 3 fingers on the left hand that had gone beyond saving. A hairline fracture in her left forearm that she had never mentioned to anyone. Dehydration so advanced that her body had begun consuming its own muscle tissue. Malnutrition, exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue into something that Orveth had only ever read about in human medical literature. A complete systemic shutdown triggered by sustained stress beyond the body's capacity to endure. She had been dying on her feet for days. She had kept working anyway. Orveth treated what he could with the supplies. They had cleaned and wrapped her damaged hands, immobilized her fractured arm, fed her water and nutrient paste through a tube he fashioned from medical equipment. And when he had done everything medicine could do, he sat beside her, and did something that no Dulani biologist had ever done for a patient of another species. He held her hand, and he talked to her. He told her about his homeworld, about the warm, shallow seas where his people had first evolved, about the rain that fell every afternoon and smelled like copper and flowers, about his children who were waiting for him to come home, and about how they were going to come home because of her, because one human woman had decided that the cold would not win. In the common area, Commander Thesic took command. He stood before the remaining crew, 16 beings from 3 species, and he looked at them with his golden eyes, fully alert and fully warm for the first time since the crash. And he spoke in a voice that carried the authority of a Sithori officer, but the conviction of something new. "She taught us how to survive," he said. "Now we prove that we learned." He organized them the way Elena would have. The Valesi took shifts maintaining the wind traps that Elena had rebuilt after the storm, working in pairs and rotating every 4 hours so that no one spent too long in the cold. And Pith volunteered for the longest and hardest shifts, and no one tried to stop him because they had all seen the look in his eyes when Elena fell, and they understood that this was how he chose to honor what she had given them. The Dulani managed the internal systems, the moisture recyclers, and the nutrition processing, and the air circulation. Tasks that required their precise minds and delicate hands, and that they performed with a care and attention that went beyond duty into something that looked very much like devotion. The Sithori stood watch and maintained the heating systems, and kept La Fogata burning in the center of the common area, feeding it power and cleaning the element, and making sure that the warm orange light never flickered, never dimmed, never went out. Because Elena had told them that as long as the fire burned, they were a crew and not victims, and they had taken that lesson into their bones. Pith the Valesi stood guard at the tunnel entrance for 16 hours at a stretch, his feathers locked tight against the cold, his sharp eyes scanning the ice for threats that probably did not exist, but that he watched for anyway, because she had watched for them, and she had never stopped, and neither would he. When the other Valesi asked him why he pushed himself so hard, he said simply, "She did not leave us." 4 words that became something like a prayer among the crew of the Aurelio in those final days. On day 14, Elena opened her eyes. She was confused at first, lost in the gap between unconsciousness and waking, tried to sit up and reach for her tools, because her body had been running on a loop of work and pain and determination for so long that it did not know how to do anything else. Thesic was there. He put his scaled hand on her shoulder, and he pressed her gently but firmly back down onto the bedding, and he said, "No." "The shelter," Elena said, and her voice was rough and broken. "The heating system needs—" "The heating system is functioning," Thesic said. "The wind traps are operational. The food supply is stable. The crew is alive." Elena stared at him, "You need to rest," Thesic said. And then he said something that he had been practicing in his mind for 2 days, words in a language that was not his own, spoken carefully and slowly, and with the weight of everything he had learned about this impossible species. "You taught us that the fire does not belong to one person," he said. "Let us carry it now." Elena opened her mouth to argue. Arguing was what humans did, because fighting was what humans did, because getting up when you should stay down, and pushing forward when you should stop, and carrying one more burden when your back was already breaking, was what humans did. But she looked at Thesic, and she saw the steadiness in his golden eyes, and she looked past him through the doorway of the medical bay, and she saw the crew moving through the shelter with purpose and coordination, maintaining the systems she had built, caring for each other in ways she had shown them, keeping the fire alive. And something inside her that had been wound tight as a wire for 14 days finally began to let go. She lay back down, and she closed her eyes, and for the first time since the crash, she allowed herself to rest. Truly rest. Not the 90-minute blackouts of a body at its breaking point, but real sleep, deep and warm and safe. The crew of the Aurelio watched over her the way she had watched over them. Days 15 through 20 settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. The worst was over, and they knew it. The storm had passed, and the shelter was holding, and the rescue ship was coming. And all they had to do was maintain and wait and keep each other alive. In the evenings, they gathered around La Fogata, and they talked. The Sithori told stories of their homeworld's great deserts, and their ancient wars, and their tradition of the quiet acceptance, which Thesic said he would be petitioning to have reviewed when they returned to Coalition space. The Valesi sang high keening melodies that echoed off the ice walls, in harmonics that made the Dulani weep with the beauty of it. The Dulani shared memories of their worn seas, and their science, and their philosophy, which held that all knowledge was sacred, and that the greatest discovery any being could make was the discovery of what another being was truly capable of. Earth. She told them about Patagonia, about the wind that came off the Southern Ocean with the smell of salt and ice, about the mountains that looked like the spine of a sleeping giant, about the stars that you could see from the bottom of the world so clearly that it felt like you could reach up and touch them. She told them about her grandmother, who had lived alone in a stone house on the edge of the steppe, and who had survived 60 winters by sheer stubbornness and accumulated wisdom, and who had taught Elena that the cold does not kill you, and the dark does not kill you, and the loneliness does not kill you. Giving up kills you, and everything else is just weather. On day 21, the sky changed. The pale violet light that had been their only sun for 3 weeks brightened and shifted, and a new point of light appeared above the horizon, growing brighter and brighter, until it resolved into the shape of a ship, the GCS Esperanza descending through the thin atmosphere on pillars of blue flame. The rescue shuttle landed 300 meters from the tunnel entrance, and a squad of Coalition personnel in full environmental suits emerged and followed the signal to the shelter. They descended into the tunnel, and they walked through the passages that Elena had carved, and they entered the deep refuge, and they stopped, and they stared. 17 beings were alive in a hand-carved underground city beneath a glacier, on a world where the temperature had not risen above -80 degrees in 3 weeks. There were biome rooms tailored to different species, with functioning climate control and moisture systems. There was a power grid running from a salvaged reactor at the bottom of a crevasse, through kilometers of hand-spliced cable. There were wind energy collectors on the surface, and a food processing system that turned fossilized microbes into nutrition, and a medical bay, and a common area with a heating element, glowing warm and orange in the center. The rescue team's leader was a Valesi admiral named Korath, who had served 40 years in the Coalition fleet. and had seen things that would fill volumes. And she looked at all of this, and she looked at the 17 survivors, and she said, "Who is responsible for this?" Every single one of them pointed at Elena. Fesic pointed at her, his scaled hands steady, and his golden eyes bright with something that his species did not have a word for, but that humans would have recognized immediately as love. Orveth pointed at her, his dark Dulani eyes shining with tears that he did not try to hide. Pith pointed at her, the young Valesi scout whose feathers still carried the frost marks of his 16-hour watches. Every Cythery, and every Dulani, and every Valesi in that room pointed at the small human woman standing at the back with her arm in a sling, and her hands wrapped in bandages, and her face carrying the marks of everything she had endured. Elena looked at Admiral Korath, and she said, "We made it. That is all that matters." But it was not all that mattered, and everyone in that room knew it. In the weeks and months that followed the rescue from Glacis 9, the story of what happened spread through Coalition space like light spreading through a dark room. Orveth published his account under the title, "The Fire That Does Not Freeze," a Dulani biologist's account of human survival instinct. And it became the most widely read xenobiology text in Coalition history, translated into every language spoken by every species in the Alliance. Commander Thesic filed a formal petition with the Coalition Species Classification Board, requesting that humans be reclassified from mid-tier adaptive to apex survival species. And the petition was approved by unanimous vote after the board members read Orveth's account and reviewed the engineering logs from the shelter. Deep Refuge was preserved as a monument on Glacis 9, with a plaque at the entrance that read in 17 languages, "Here a human taught the galaxy that the fire does not belong to one person." Elena returned to Earth for medical treatment. She lost 2 fingers to the frostbite, and the doctors rebuilt what they could and gave her prosthetics for the rest. And when they were done, they told her she was lucky to be alive. And she smiled, because luck had nothing to do with it. The Coalition offered her a desk job at headquarters on the Central Station, a prestigious position with a good salary and a warm office, and no chance of ever being cold again. She turned it down. She requested reassignment to deep space survey work, the kind of mission that went to the edges of the map, where the stars were thin and the worlds were unknown, and anything could happen. They gave her a new ship. On her last night on Earth, before departure, she stood on the observation deck and looked up at the sky above Patagonia. And she thought about her grandmother, and about Thesic, and about Pith, and about the Kethrani who had died in her arms, and about the one who had died alone, and about the fire in the center of a room carved from ice at the bottom of a frozen world. She flexed her scarred hand, and felt the prosthetic fingers respond, and she watched the stars turn slowly overhead. And somewhere out there, beyond the light of familiar suns, there was another impossible world, waiting for someone stubborn enough to survive it. 48 hours to dig a second shelter deeper than the first, deeper than the glacier itself, down into the frozen bedrock of a planet that wanted them dead. Elena did the math in her head while she stood in the common area of El Refugio and looked at the 18 faces looking back at her. 18 beings from 4 species who had learned over the past 9 days to trust her with their lives, even though she was the smallest and the weakest and the most fragile person in the room. She needed to carve a new set of chambers at least 20 meters below the current shelter, connected by a reinforced tunnel that could withstand 400-kilometer winds and the shifting pressure of a glacier in a superstorm. She needed to move all the heating systems, all the insulation, all the supplies, and all the people down to the new level before the storm hit. She needed to do this on 2 hours of sleep per day and a diet of million-year-old microbial paste and recycled water. She picked up her cutting torch and she said 2 words, "Follow me." The next 48 hours became something that Orvith would later describe in his writings as the most extraordinary sustained effort he had ever witnessed from any living being in his 200 years of biological study. Elena worked in shifts of 20 hours on and 90 minutes off, and during the 90 minutes she did not really sleep, but rather fell into a state that was closer to unconsciousness than rest, her body shutting down the minimum number of systems necessary to keep functioning before dragging itself back to wakefulness. She cut into the ice with the torch, and when the torch overheated, she used the emergency laser cutter. And when the laser cutter ran out of charge, she used hand tools, hammering and chiseling at frozen rock with the kind of grim, relentless fury that the Scythorai associated with their ancient war legends, and the Valesi associated with the great storms of their homeworld. But she was not alone this time. The crew of the Aurelio had spent 9 days watching Elena Vargas refuse to let them die, and something had changed in them, something that went deeper than gratitude or admiration, something that felt more like a decision. The Valesi worked beside her in the tunnels, their feathered bodies insulated enough to handle the cold for hours at a stretch, and they learned to use the cutting tools with a speed and precision that made Elena nod with something that might have been pride. Pith, the young scout, was the best of them, tireless and quick and determined in a way that reminded Elena of herself when she was younger, and had not yet learned that the body has limits, even if the spirit does not. She found him working in the lower tunnel at hour 30, with frost forming on his feathers and his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, and she grabbed him by the arm and pulled him back toward the warm zone. "You need to rest," she said. "You have not rested," he said. "I am human," she said. "My species was built for this." "Then I will learn to be built for this too," Pitt said, and he tried to pull his arm free and go back to digging. Elena held on, and she looked at this young alien, who was so far from his warm, windy homeworld, and who was killing himself trying to match the pace of a species that had been forged in ice ages. And she felt something crack inside her chest that was not a rib, but was just as painful. She took off her own thermal blanket, the one she had been wearing since the first day, and that was stained with her sweat and her blood and the gray residue of microbial paste. And she wrapped it around Pith, and she said, "Rest now, dig later. That is an order from someone who outranks you in stubbornness." Pith rested. The others kept working. Commander Thesic, who had spent the first days of the crisis in torpor, now stood watch shifts at the tunnel entrance, despite the cold that made every minute a battle against his own biology, his golden eyes scanning the surface through the howling wind for any sign of the coming storm. Orvith the Dulani developed a system for recycling moisture in the new deep chambers, using condensation traps made from curved pieces of hull metal that collected water from the warm air exhaled by the crew and redirected it into the humid room. A solution so elegant that Elena told him it was the best piece of engineering she had seen since the crash. Even the surviving Kethrani helped, the last 3 members of their species on the crew, using their precise, multi-jointed mandibles to perform fine mechanical work on the heating systems that no other species could manage, soldering connections and adjusting flow regulators with a delicacy that made Elena's bruised and frostbitten human fingers look like crude tools by comparison. On the morning of day 11, stood in the new deep refuge and looked at what they had built together. It was smaller than the original shelter, but it was stronger, carved into bedrock rather than ice, reinforced with structural beams salvaged from the ship's skeleton, insulated with layers of material so thick that the walls felt warm to the touch, even though the rock beyond them was colder than the vacuum of space. She had recreated the biome rooms, the hot room and the humid room and the common area with La Fogata in the center, and she had built a storage chamber for their remaining food and water, and a medical bay where the injured could rest. She moved everyone down. 6 hours later, the storm hit. It began with a sound like the end of everything, a roar so deep and so vast that it seemed to come from inside the planet itself. And then the wind arrived, and it was not like any wind that any of them had ever known. 400 kilometers per hour. Gone in minutes. The wind traps, and the external equipment, and the remains of the Aurelio's forward hull, torn away and scattered across the ice like toys thrown by an angry child. The original Refugio collapsed under the pressure. The ice chambers that Elena had carved so carefully crushed and filled with driven snow and shattered debris. The tunnel to deep refuge groaned and flexed, and for one terrible moment Elena heard a crack that sounded like the world breaking in half. And she thought, this is it. This is where it ends. 11 days of fighting, and it ends with the ceiling coming down. But the structural beams held. They held because Elena had over-engineered them, had used twice as many as she calculated were necessary, because her grandmother had taught her that the storm is always worse than you think, and the night is always longer than you plan for. For 30 hours, the storm raged above them, and they sat in the deep refuge and listened to the planet, trying to tear itself apart. The temperature outside dropped to negative 138 degrees. Inside the shelter it dropped too, as the walls of bedrock conducted the impossible cold inward, and the heating system strained to compensate, and the crew huddled closer together around La Fogata and watched the orange light flicker. At hour 16 of the storm, the power line to the reactor was severed. Elena felt it happen, felt the subtle change in the hum of the heating system, felt the temperature begin its slow slide toward death, and she knew exactly what it meant and exactly what she had to do. Thesic saw her pick up her tools and move toward the tunnel, and he grabbed her arm with a strength that surprised them both. "You cannot go out there," he said. "The tunnel to the surface is compromised. The original shelter has collapsed. The conditions are unsurvivable." "The power line needs to be spliced," Elena said. "If I do not fix it, we lose heat in 4 hours, and everyone in this room dies in 6. "Then we die," Thesic said, and his voice carried the weight of Scythori doctrine, the quiet acceptance, the rational choice. Elena looked at him, and she smiled, and it was the saddest smile Thesic had ever seen on any face of any species. "No," she said, "we do not." She pulled her arm free, and she walked into the tunnel. The journey to the break in the power line took her through the collapsed remains of the original Refugio, crawling through spaces that had shrunk to half their original size under the weight of shifted ice. Her body pressed against the frozen ground as she dragged herself forward by her elbows. She found the break where a slab of displaced glacier had sheared through the conduit, and she spliced it back together with her bare hands because her gloves were too thick to handle the delicate connections. The cold took 3 of her fingers in those minutes, going white and then gray and then numb in a way that she knew meant they would never feel anything again. She completed the splice, and the power flowed, and somewhere behind her, in the deep refuge, the heating system surged back to life, and 18 beings felt the warmth return and breathed again. Elena crawled back through the ruins and emerged into the tunnel, and walked the last 50 meters on legs that had stopped shaking because they had gone beyond shaking into a stillness that frightened her more than the cold ever had. The storm passed on day 12. They emerged through the tunnel into a world that had been remade by the wind. The glacier shifted and carved into new shapes, the crash site buried under meters of fresh ice, the sky a pale violet that looked almost gentle after the fury that had filled it. 18 of them stood in the light of a sun that gave no warmth and looked at each other and counted heads and confirmed what they already knew. One more had been lost. The last Kethrani, the final survivor of his species on the crew, had died quietly in the dark during the worst hours of the storm, while everyone else was focused on survival. His cracked exoskeleton finally giving way, his compound eyes going dark, without anyone there to see. Elena had not been there to hold him. Her name and Pitt's feathered arms catching her before she hit the ground. She had kept them alive for Ella. By the 7th day, Elena had built something that should not have existed on a world like Glacis IX. She called it El Refugio, and the name stuck, even among species that had never spoken a word of Spanish in their lives, because the sound of it carried a meaning that went beyond language, a promise that there was a place where the cold could not reach you and the wind could not find you, and you could close your eyes without wondering if you would open them again. It was carved into the glacier itself, a network of chambers and tunnels that spread beneath the ice like the roots of some impossible underground tree. Every room had been designed with a purpose that the aliens were only beginning to understand. The hot room was for the Sci-Fi. Elena had run dedicated heating conduits from the reactor power line into a chamber she had carved with thick walls and a double-sealed entrance, and she had packed the gaps with insulating material stripped from the ship's hull until the temperature inside held steady at 30 degrees, warm enough to pull the Sithori back from torpor and keep their blood flowing and their minds sharp. Commander Thesic woke fully for the first time in 4 days in that room, and when he opened his golden eyes and felt the warmth on his scales, he made a sound that Elena had never heard a Sithori make before, a low rumbling vibration deep in his chest that she later learned was an expression of gratitude so profound that it was only used once or twice in a Sithori lifetime. The humid room was for the Dulani. Elena had figured out that if she melted ice slowly over the heating elements and piped the steam through a series of curved tunnels before releasing it into a sealed chamber, she could create conditions that were close enough to the Dulani homeworld to keep their skin from cracking and their mucous membranes from drying out. Orveth, the Dulani biologist, had wept when he entered that room, tears running down his smooth amphibian face, because for the first time since the crash he could breathe without pain and move without feeling his skin tear. The common area was the largest chamber, a broad space with curved ice walls that Elena had polished smooth with heated metal plates until they reflected the light from the emergency lamps, like mirrors. And in the center of this room she had placed a heating element that glowed with a steady orange light. She called it La Fogata. On my world, she told the crew one evening as they gathered around its warmth, for most of our history, we survived by gathering around fire. It was not just about the heat. It was about being together, knowing that you were not alone in the dark. My grandmother told me that the first human who made fire did not just push back the cold, they pushed back the loneliness. The Velesi scout named Pith translated this for the other Velesi in their own whistling language. About the way he said it made them all go very still and look at the glowing element with new eyes. Over those 7 days, the aliens began to understand something about humans that no xenobiology textbook had ever captured. It was not that Elena was stronger than them. She was not. She was a small woman from a small country on a small planet, and any Sithori could have snapped her arm with one hand. It was not that she was smarter. The Dulani had cognitive processing speeds that made human brains look like outdated computers, and the Kithrani had mathematical abilities that bordered on precognitive. It was that she simply would not stop. The Galactic Coalition had classified humans as a mid-tier species, clever enough to be useful and durable enough to serve on mixed crews, but nothing remarkable in a galaxy full of beings who could see in ultraviolet or breathe methane or communicate through electromagnetic pulses. But watching Elena Vargas work for 20 hours straight in conditions that would have killed most humans on Earth, watching her solve problems with a combination of ancient knowledge and raw creativity that left the Coalition-trained engineers speechless. Watching her care for 20 different beings from 4 different species with a fierce tenderness that never wavered, even when she was so tired she could barely stand. They began to think that perhaps the classification system was missing something important. Thesic had that conversation with her on the 5th day, after he had recovered enough to walk and think clearly. He found her in the tunnel between the common area and the hot room, sitting on the ice floor with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, stealing 5 minutes of rest between tasks. "Vargas," he said, lowering himself to sit beside her with the careful movements of a reptilian body that was still not fully warm. "Commander," she said, without opening her eyes. "In Sci-Fi military doctrine," he said, "the protocol for a survival situation of this severity is called the quiet acceptance. We calculate who has the highest probability of survival, and we focus resources on them, and we allow the others to pass with dignity." Elena opened her eyes and looked at him. "You let people die," she said. "We accept the reality of the situation," Thesic said. "We do not waste resources on those who cannot be saved. It is considered the rational approach." Elena was quiet for a moment, and Thesic could see something moving behind her eyes. Not anger exactly, but something harder and hotter than anger. Something that burned. "On Earth," she said, "we have a different doctrine. Nobody gets left behind until there is no one left to carry them." Thesic considered this. "That is not rational," he said. "No," Elena said. "It is not, but it is why we are all still alive." She stood up and picked up her tools and went back to work. And Thesic sat there in the tunnel for a long time, thinking about what she had said, and about the 3 Kethrani, and the Dulani, and the Sci-Thori elder who had died, and about how Elena had held every single one of them as they went, and had mourned every single one of them, and had then picked up her torch and kept digging. He thought about what it meant to come from a world where the cold tried to kill you every winter for 100,000 years, and your answer was not to accept it, but to fight it with everything you had, to build fires and dig shelters and wrap your arms around the people beside you and say, "No, not tonight. Tonight we live." The food problem Elena solved on day 6, when she discovered something remarkable in the glacier itself. The ice of Glacis 9 was not dead. Trapped in layers that were millions of years old were thin bands of frozen microbial mats, extremophile organisms that had once thrived in whatever passed for warm seasons on this world, before the ice age that had swallowed it entirely. Elena cut these bands out of the ice walls, thawed them, and processed them through the ship's emergency nutrition system into a thick, gray paste that tasted like mud mixed with something that had died a very long time ago. Everyone ate it. No one complained. On day 8, Orveth began writing. He sat in the humid room with a salvaged datapad, and he started documenting everything Elena had done from the moment of the crash. Every decision she had made, every structure she had built, every life she had saved, and every death she had refused to accept. He titled his document, "The Fire That Does Not Freeze," and when the other crew members asked him why he was writing instead of working, he looked at them with his large, dark eyes, and said, "Because someday the galaxy needs to know what happened here, and what this human did, and how wrong we were about her species." On day 9, the distress beacon received a. Elena was on the surface building wind traps, structures that caught the constant blizzard winds and converted them into kinetic energy to supplement the reactor, when her communicator crackled to life with a signal she had been waiting 9 days to hear. "Rescue confirmed," the message said. "GCS Esperanza en route. Estimated arrival 21 days from initial distress call. 12 days from current date." Elena closed her eyes and let the relief wash through her for exactly 3 seconds. Then the second part of the message came through. "Warning," the signal said. "Massive polar storm system forming in northern hemisphere. Projected path includes your coordinates. Estimated arrival 48 hours. Projected wind speeds 400 kilometers per hour. Projected temperature drop 40 additional degrees." Elena opened her eyes and looked at El Refugio, at the shelter she had carved from nothing with her own bleeding hands. Certainty of a woman who had grown up reading weather and ice and wind, that it would not survive a storm like that. She went below and found Thesic, and she showed him the data, and she watched his golden eyes widen. "What do we do?" he asked. Elena looked at the floor beneath her feet, at the ice that went down and down and down into the bedrock of this frozen world. The crevasse was a wound in the world, a crack that ran deep into the glacier like something massive had split the ice with an axe, and then walked away without looking back. Elena stood at its edge and stared down into the darkness where the aft section of the Aurelio had fallen, and she could see nothing at all, because the blizzard had swallowed the light, and the cold had swallowed everything else. She tied the cable to a shard of hull plating that was jammed into the ice near the edge, and tested it 3 times, because if it failed, she would fall, and no one would come to find her, and 22 people would die slowly in a broken ship, while the planet ate them alive. Then she went over the edge. The descent was 40 meters of pure terror, her hands burning inside her gloves as the cable slid through them, the wind trying to smash her against the ice walls, her boots scrambling for grip on surfaces that were smoother than glass and colder than anything she had ever touched. She found the reactor section wedged between 2 walls of ancient ice at the bottom, crumpled and broken, but still humming with the deep, steady vibration of a fusion core that refused to die. Military-grade engineering, she thought, and she almost laughed, because the reactor was tougher than the ship it had powered, and tougher than any of the people it was supposed to keep alive. She spent the next 5 hours down there in the dark. 5 hours of cutting and splicing and welding cable connections with fingers that she could barely feel, her breath freezing on the inside of her visor so that she had to wipe it clear every few minutes, her body shaking so hard that she had to stop and clench her fists and count to 10 before she could hold a tool steady again. She ran power conduit from the reactor up the wall of the crevasse, anchoring it with pitons hammered into the ice, testing each connection twice because there would be no second chance at this period. When she finally climbed back up the cable and pulled herself over the edge onto the surface, she lay on her back on the ice for a full minute and looked up at a sky she could not see through the storm, and she breathed and she felt her heart pounding, and she allowed herself that 1 minute of stillness. Then she got up, because there was no time for anything else. She followed her own tracks back to the ship, hauling the power cable behind her, and when she reached the airlock and cycled through and stepped inside, she found a scene that made her stop in the doorway. 3 of them were dead. 2 Kathrani had died together, their exoskeletons cracked open along the thorax seams from the thermal contraction, their beautiful compound eyes gone dark and still, their bodies curled around each other in a final embrace that looked like they had been trying to share whatever warmth they had left. The third was a young Dulani whose skin had dried and split in the frozen air until he simply could not hold himself together anymore. Elena stood there, and she looked at them, and something inside her chest tightened like a fist closing around her heart. But she did not cry, and she did not stop, because crying would not warm the living, and stopping would only add to the count of the dead. She crossed the corridor to the power junction box, and connected the cable from the reactor, and for a moment nothing happened, and she felt a spike of fear, so sharp it was like being stabbed. Then the heating grid hummed to life, and warm air began to flow through the vents, and a sound went through the survivors that was not quite a cheer, and not quite a sob, but something in between, that every species in the galaxy would have recognized as relief. But it was not enough. Elena could feel the heat bleeding away through every crack and tear in the shattered hull, escaping into the hungry dark outside like water through a broken cup. Was a temporary fix, and she knew it, and Thesic knew it, and even the Valesi, who were the toughest of the aliens, could feel the truth in the way the warmth faded as soon as it arrived. She gathered the crew who could still move. 6 Valesi who were cold but functional, their feathers puffed out to maximum insulation, their dark eyes sharp and alert. 3 Dulani, who were wrapping themselves in strips of thermal sheeting and moving carefully to avoid cracking their drying skin. 2 Scytheri, who were fighting torpor with every breath, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were swimming through invisible mud. And she told them what she was going to do. "Ice is an insulator," she said, and she could see the confusion on their faces, because to them ice was the enemy. Ice was the thing that was killing them. Ice was death made solid. "On my world," she said, "my ancestors survived winters that lasted months by building shelters out of snow and ice, because once you get below the surface, the temperature stabilizes, and the wind cannot reach you, and your own body heat reflects back from the walls." She picked up the cutting torch and pointed toward the ground beneath their feet. "We are going to dig," she said. "We are going to carve a shelter into this glacier, and we are going to move everyone inside, and we are going to survive." Commander Thesic looked at her from beneath the emergency blankets she had wrapped around him, and his golden eyes held something that might have been wonder, or might have been the beginning of something like faith. "Tell us what to do," he said. So she told them. The Valesi became her primary work crew because they could handle the cold longest, and she showed them how to use the cutting tools to carve blocks of ice, and how to shape chambers with curved walls that would hold pressure and trap heat. The Dulani worked inside the hull, preparing insulation material from salvaged padding and hull lining, their delicate hands perfect for the detailed work, even as they struggled to keep their skin moist. The Scythori she rotated in shifts near the heating vents, bringing them close to warm up and then sending them to do light work before the cold took them again, a constant rotation that kept them alive but never comfortable. And Elena dug. She dug for hours that blurred together into a single continuous act of cutting and hauling and shaping, her arms burning and her back screaming, and her frost-bitten fingers sending jolts of pain up through her wrists every time she gripped the torch. She carved a room out of the living ice, 6 meters by 4 meters by 3 meters tall, with smooth curved walls and a low entrance tunnel that would trap the warm air inside. It was rough, and it was ugly, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever built. She moved the worst cases in first, the remaining Kethrani, who were barely alive, and the Scythori, who were deep in torpor, carrying them herself when no one else could manage the weight, laying them down on insulated bedding on the ice floor, and sealing the entrance with a makeshift door cut from hull plating. The temperature inside the ice room stabilized at -10, which was still cold enough to kill any of the aliens slowly, but was survivable with the heating elements she had placed along the walls, and the body heat of the people inside. That first night in the ice room, 2 more Kethrani died. They went quietly in the dark, their systems simply shutting down one function at a time until there was nothing left to shut down. And Elena sat beside them and held their cold, brittle hands, and whispered words in Spanish that they could not understand, but that carried a warmth no translator could capture. "Lo siento," she said to them. "Lo siento mucho." When the others woke and saw the dead, a silence fell over the ice room that was heavier than the glacier above them. Elena stood up, and she looked at the 20 survivors, and she picked up her cutting torch. "I need to make this bigger," she said. "I need to make rooms for each of you. Warm rooms and wet rooms and rooms where you can breathe, and I need to do it before more of us die." No one argued with her. No one asked if it was possible. They just watched her walk back into the tunnel, and they listened to the sound of the torch cutting into the ice, and they understood that this human woman was fighting a war against a planet, and she had absolutely no intention of losing. Outside, the storm raged on, and the temperature dropped to -95, and the night still had 40 hours left to run. It was a sound that Elena Vargas would never forget. A deep groaning cry of metal twisting against itself, as the GCS Aurelio broke apart in the atmosphere of a world that had no name and no mercy. She was in the lower engineering bay when it happened, running a routine check on the water recyclers, humming an old song her grandmother used to sing back in Patagonia, when the floor lurched sideways and threw her into the wall, hard enough to crack her helmet visor. The emergency lights came on, bathing everything in red, and the ship's AI began speaking in that calm and terrible voice that all ship systems used when things had gone very wrong. Catastrophic drive failure detected. All crew report to emergency stations. Brace for planetary impact. Elena grabbed a support beam and held on as the Aurelio plunged through clouds of methane and ice crystals toward a world the nav computer had barely registered before everything went dark. Stages. First, the belly of the ship hit a ridge of solid ice at an angle that should have killed everyone aboard. And the forward section skidded across the frozen surface like a stone thrown across a lake, tearing open compartments and scattering debris across kilometers of white nothing. Then the aft section, where the main reactor lived, broke free and tumbled sideways into a massive crack in the glacier. A crevasse so deep that the sound of the wreckage hitting the bottom took a long time to reach the surface. And then there was silence. Elena pulled herself up from the floor and tasted blood in her mouth, and felt the cold already creeping in through the shattered hull like a living thing with fingers and teeth. She had felt cold before. Real cold. Not the kind that came from a broken climate system on a space station, but the kind that came from standing on the edge of the world in southern Argentina, where the wind came straight from Antarctica, and the sky was so clear it looked like it could cut you. This was worse. She checked her suit readout and saw the external temperature, and for a moment she thought the sensor was broken, because no planet should be this cold. -90 degrees and dropping, with winds that carried methane ice like tiny knives. But the sensor was not broken, and this world was exactly that cold, and Elena understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt like swallowing ice water, that most of the people on this ship had never felt anything like this, and had no idea what was coming for them. She made her way through the wreckage toward the main crew compartment, climbing over collapsed bulkheads and stepping around things she did not want to look at too closely. And when she reached the central corridor, she found them, 23 survivors out of 40. Commander Thesic of the Sithori was there, the big reptilian officer leaning against a wall, with his golden eyes already going dull, and his movements slow, in a way that Elena recognized immediately as the beginning of torpor, the shutdown response that cold-blooded species could not control when the temperature dropped. The Kethrani were in the worst shape, the insectoid crew members huddled together, with their beautiful iridescent exoskeletons already showing hairline cracks from the thermal shock, their mandibles clicking into stress calls that sounded like breaking glass. The Dulani, the amphibian biologists, with their soft wet skin and their gentle dark eyes, were wrapping themselves in anything they could find, because the dry frozen air was pulling moisture from their bodies faster than they could produce it. Only the Valesi seemed to be holding, the bird-like scouts, with their dense layers of down-like feathers, standing in a tight group near what remained of the communications array, their sharp eyes tracking Elena as she entered. She had served with all of them for 8 months on this survey mission, and she knew their names and their habits, and which ones liked sweet tea, and which ones played cards badly, and which ones sang when they thought no one was listening. And she knew with absolute certainty that if she did not do something right now, most of them would be dead before the night was over. And on this world, the night lasted 62 hours. She went to Thesic first, because he was the ranking officer, and because she needed his authority, even if he was fading fast. "Commander," she said, kneeling beside him and putting her warm hands on his cold, scaled face. "Commander, I need you to listen to me." His eyes focused on her slowly like a machine powering up from standby. "Vargas," he said, and his voice was thick and slow. "Status report." "The ship is broken in two," she said. The reactor section fell into a crevasse about 300 meters east of here. The forward hull is holding, but we are losing heat fast. Power gives us maybe 6 hours before internal temperature drops below survivable range for your species and the Kethrani. Thesic blinked, and she could see him processing this. Could see the old Sithori military training, fighting against the cold that was trying to shut his brain down. "The distress beacon," he said. "Broadcasting," Elena said. "But the nearest relay is 11 light-years out. Best case rescue is 21 days. She watched that number land on him like a physical blow. 21 days on a world that was killing them right now, in this moment, with every breath they took. "What do you need?" Thesic said, and Elena felt something shift in the room, because every alien in that broken corridor heard their commander ask the human what she needed, and they all understood what that meant. Elena stood up and looked at them, these beautiful and terrified beings, who came from worlds of warm rain and golden sunlight and gentle breezes, had never known what it meant to fight the cold, who had never had to learn because their evolution had never demanded it. But hers had. 10,000 years of ice ages and frozen plains and long winters that killed everything that was not clever enough or stubborn enough to survive them, had built something into the human species that no amount of civilization could erase. Elena Vargas was cold and she was bleeding and she was scared, but she was not beaten, because she came from a long line of people who had looked at the worst the universe could offer and had answered it with fire. "Everything you can carry," she said to Thesic, "and the will to keep moving." Then she grabbed a cutting torch and a coil of cable and sealed her cracked helmet with emergency tape and walked to the airlock. The outer door opened, and the cold hit her like a wall of pure hate, and the wind screamed in her ears, and she could not see more than 10 meters in any direction. The driving ice. Somewhere out there in the dark, at the bottom of a crevasse, was a fusion reactor that could keep them all alive. She stepped out into the storm. Behind her, 22 aliens watched the airlock close and wondered what kind of creature walks willingly into the mouth of hell.